Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 316, I chat with SpectraCal's chief color scientist, Stacy Spears, about his company's work on high dynamic range. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded August 11th, 2016. Episode 316, SpectraCal on HDR. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Epson's new EcoTank printers. With Epson's line of SuperTank all-in-one printers, you can print thousands of documents without running out of ink. EcoTank is loaded and ready to print when you are. Visit epson.com/ecotank to find out more. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the home theater geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week's guest geek is Stacy Spears, chief color scientist at SpectraCal, now a part of Portrait Displays. Hey, Stacy, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you. Glad to be back.
Glad to have you here. Those of you who are watching live at live.twit.tv can get into the chat room there, or at irc.twit.tv, and you can post questions as we go, and I'll pass along as many as I can. It's always a good idea to use my screen name, which is my name, Scott Wilkinson, no dots or dashes or spaces, in the message that you post there in the chat room, because that shows up in a different color on my screen, and I can see it more immediately. So, Stacy, I wanted to have you on the show because you've been looking at a bunch of different HDR displays and Ultra HD Blu-ray, and I would love to share with my audience some of what you've discovered, because it's kind of the Wild West out there in HDR land, isn't it?
It is. It's actually very, very early in HDR. I think studios are still trying to figure out how to master the content, where they want to, how bright they want to make it. Display manufacturers, I think, have a lot to learn about tone mapping. You know, Dolby started well over 10 years ago on HDR. You know, they've created the curve. Everyone's using that curve now. But it's the tone mapping playback side where I think everyone's playing catch up to Dolby.
Exactly. And just so that everyone's on the same page with us, when you mention the curve, you're talking about what we call the PQ curve, perceptual quantizer, which Dolby developed and replaces gamma as the electro-optical transfer function, or EOTF. I know this is alphabet soup, but it's the way it is in this business, which basically determines how a display will respond to a given brightness value in the signal that's coming into it, and how much light it will put out in response to that value. We've been using gamma for many, many years, decades, and now we're replacing that mostly with PQ, which is somewhat different, and we may get into that a little bit today. But anyway, that's the curve that Stacy's talking about that we really need to talk about. In fact, sorry, go ahead, Stacy.
Well, I was going to say, you know, both gamma and PQ are transfer functions. You know,
yes.
It's just different types. I know some people like to call PQ gamma, and it's not gamma, but it's just another type of transfer function.
Right, exactly right. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. That's very good.
With obviously one difference being that gamma is, you stretch gamma, so whatever 0 to 1 fills up the entire range of the TV, whereas, as you mentioned earlier, PQ is absolute. So a corresponding code value will correspond to an actual light output level.
Right, exactly. And this is one of the big differences between standard dynamic range, or SDR, and high dynamic range, or HDR, is this transfer function is relative in SDR. And it goes from, as you said, goes from 0 to 1. And that, you know, whatever the display can do, then the brightest it can do is represented by 1, and the lowest it can do is represented by 0. Whereas PQ is tied to specific luminance values or amounts of light coming off the screen. And that's one big difference. And I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to actually start there. SDR is pretty well defined. I mean, as I said, we've been doing it for decades, but it's been mastered to a peak brightness or luminance of 100 nits with this gamma curve and a specific color gamut, that is range of colors that can be represented. And TVs, calibrated TVs will conform to that. Mastering monitors will conform to that. Everybody's all happy because it's all the same. Now in HDR land, it's not. Different TVs have different capabilities. Different mastering monitors have different capabilities. And so I've been asking people who have been on the show regarding HDR, how are we going to deal with that? The fact that, you know, you might master at a particular brightness or luminance level, but then that content comes home and the TV can't do that, or it'll do something different, or a certain color gamut, and then the TV will do a certain different color gamut. How can we live in this land of unknowns?
Well, I would say we don't have to live in that land of unknown forever. You know, Dolby tried to plan for the future by going with 10,000 nits, and the industry's gone with BT 2020. So while we can't hit it today, let's say in 5 years, we might be hitting 10,000 nits in 2020, or it might take 10 years. But there's already displays that are close to 10,000 nits. You just haven't seen them yet. The gamut, I think, is the bigger issue, getting the wider gamut without using lasers.
Right, exactly. Well, quantum dots might be one possibility. I recently had on somebody from Nanosys to talk about how quantum dots can get pretty close to 2020. And by the way, again, just for the background, for those of you who might not know all this nomenclature, the range of colors that can be reproduced by any display is called its gamut. And the one we've been using for a long time in high definition is called 709 or BT 709 or Rec 709. And now we're talking about this BT 2020 or Rec 2020, which is, there aren't very many displays that can do it yet because it's so wide and the primaries, red, green, and blue, are so difficult to reproduce without lasers or quantum dots. Do you think quantum dots might offer us a little quicker road to the ability to reproduce 2020? I
assume so. I mean, they're not quite hitting P3 today, so they still have a little ways to go, but we'll get there. It's just...
We'll get there. Yeah.
It's nice. Well, if you look at 709, displays have been able to outdo 709 for many, many years. So it's kind of a standard that we would already exceed it, but we couldn't take advantage of.
Right.
Newer technologies.
Right.
So this way, at least we sort of given ourselves some runway to sort of kind of grow into it and get better over time. You know, one way you can look at it is, I say this sarcastically, yet from a studio standpoint, it gives them more reasons to re-release T2. Because they can do a 4,000 nit version today. They could do a 6,000 nit version next year in the special edition, and then the year after a 10,000 nit version. So they can keep re-releasing catalogs that we can keep repurchasing. You know, well, if I'm sarcastic and cynical.
Yes, exactly. You know, it's like in the audio world of, oh man, I get to buy the White Album again. That's the same sort of deal, huh?
Exactly. Except in the video world, it seems to be T2 or the fifth. It
seems to be. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we don't have a consistent ecosystem now of everybody's mastering to the same brightness, everybody's watching at the same brightness with the same color. That's in flux, and it's going to be for a while. And that's one of the big deals about Ultra HD and high dynamic range. As you say, it provides room for future growth, which really is a good thing. But in the early stages where we are now, I think it does cause some confusion. And
this is where the tone mapping comes into play.
Exactly.
So if we look at Dolby defined the EOTF, the transfer function that we're all using, and they also defined their tone and gamut mapping. But everyone's adopted the EOTF portion, but nobody wants to pay to adopt the full Dolby Vision solution. So instead, we have display manufacturers out there trying to do their own tone mapping, which is all different. So there's no standard. And in some cases, some of the displays aren't even doing tone mapping at all. They're just clipping. And once we start to talk about metadata in a little bit, we'll also, you know, there's more on that as well.
Right, which we're going to talk about definitely during this show. But before we do, we got a couple of questions in the chat room. Let's see. UJ is asking, What do you think, Stacy, about including the tech specs on UHD Blu-ray that consist of the entire production chain from camera to mastering?
So the way we create content is called display referred. So it doesn't matter what camera you capture on, because as soon as you pull it into the color grading station and you start making visual adjustments, you're looking at a display. So that's kind of where it's from that display on that matters. And you actually bring up a good point, which is when we talk about metadata, but I'll touch on it now. A lot of basically all of the currently available HDR content today is specifying the sort of absolute or technical specs for P3, right? The perfect specs. But there's not a grading monitor out there that actually meets those specs or has those primaries. So right now, I would argue that all HDR content has the wrong primaries in it. Not a big deal today because it's close to P3. Like even the BVM can't hit P3. It's like 99% of P3. But the coordinates are close. But once we go beyond that, and we start to go beyond P3, but not yet 2020, hopefully they don't try to put P3 or 2020. They put the actual grading monitor specs in, which means you need to find a way to get the XY coordinates from that mastering display done at some post house to the compressionist who's actually encoding the content.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I just wanted to, again, make sure that everybody understood. We've been talking about color gamuts here. Stacy mentioned P3, which is the gamut of colors or the range of colors, the red, green, and blue primaries used in digital cinema, and now is more or less the target that we're kind of aiming for in home TVs, HDR TVs, and so on. We can't get to 2020 yet, but P3 is still wider, has more range of colors than 709, so it does give you a different color experience.
But it goes back to the question he asked, where we want to put the actual XY coordinates or primaries of the monitor used to grade the film into the content itself. And right now, today, they're not doing that. They're just putting in the theoretical primaries versus the actual primaries. Because even if you take 5 of these Sony monitors, which is a fantastic monitor, probably one of the best, each one's going to be slightly different because of, whether how old it is, how it's aged, or just differences.
Manufacturing tolerances.
Exactly.
Or fabrication tolerances in the case of OLED.
Yeah.
And Stacy, again, here is talking about the Sony BVM X300, which is an OLED, a 30-inch OLED reference monitor, mastering monitor, that we're going to actually take a look at how it performs against some other TVs here in just a second. Creamy Corncob in the chat room is asking, is the level of quality of HDR in the Xbox One S the same as other, maybe more expensive standalone UHD Blu-ray players?
So Tyler has one, but we haven't actually taken a look at it yet, other than using it to sort of measure what Netflix is doing, since that's the only device. That and the Shield will output HDR over HDMI for Netflix. Beyond that, we haven't actually had a chance because there's really just that and the Samsung in the US right now. I haven't gotten access to the Panasonic.
Or the Philips. There's also a Philips one that I think is available.
Is Philips made by Philips or is it OEM from someone else? That's always sort of the problem with players is...
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we'll probably talk about it shortly as the upcoming SMPTE paper we're working on. But by that time, which is in October, we'll actually have gone through all the players to see how they're performing and what they're doing.
Oh, good. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to that for sure. We are going to talk about that in a moment.
Yeah. So I think the only thing we know today is that the Xbox can't output Atmos.
It cannot output Atmos?
Cannot, no.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. So that's good. That's bad news, but it's good information.
And it also doesn't output 422 10-bit. It'll do 444 10-bit or RGB 10-bit, but no 422. Whether or not that's an issue, not quite sure yet.
Yeah. Now, that's another thing that I'd like to make sure everybody knows about. 422, 444, 420 is called chroma or color subsampling. And it's basically a way to reduce the amount of information being transmitted by removing some of the color information, which theoretically doesn't matter because our eyes aren't as sensitive to color detail as they are to black and white detail. And so 420 is sort of the most compression, the most information removed. 422 is a little less. 444 is no information removed. My question to you about that is, Ultra HD Blu-ray, still like Blu-ray, like regular HD Blu-ray, uses 420 color subsampling. Both of them do. So why would it be important if the Xbox could output 422 or 444?
So first, the 420 on UHD Blu-ray is different than regular Blu-ray.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
In fact, I'm calling it right now ChromaBug 2020 instead of ChromaBug 2 because it's a 2020 issue, not a Blu-ray issue, or not a UHD Blu-ray issue. So if we look at 420, horizontally, chroma is co-sided. It's located with the luma sample, but vertically it was between two luma samples. But with the 2020 version, they've now also co-sided it vertically. So what happens is if you use the traditional Blu-ray or any H.264, chroma upsampling, you'll get a half pixel shift vertically, basically vertical YC delay if you use the wrong algorithm. And right now, very few people have implemented the right algorithm. So, but I thought because it's, instead of calling it ChromaBug 2.0, it's ChromaBug 2020 since it's 2020's fault. Basically, the 2020 specification or recommendation decided to change the chroma co-siding. And it's very subtle the way it's written, but it's kind of causing problems right now. And that's one of the things we'll be looking at.
Right.
Because we always got to have when we introduce a new format, we have to introduce new issues to fix.
Of course. And you were instrumental in uncovering the original chroma bug in Blu-ray. And now we have it in Ultra HD Blu-ray, a slightly different one.
Well, we may have it. So it depends on the player and on the display. So this goes back to your question. 422 versus 444 coming from a 420 format. Well, it all depends on the quality of the upsampling. I can give you anecdotal. So, for example, I have a Samsung projector at home, the Jokane DLP one. If you send in 422, you actually get a horizontal half pixel shift. But if you send in 444, you get perfect alignment. And that's because the projector's conversion to 444 uses nearest neighbor, which can't handle this co-located samples that I talked about. So it all depends on the device. So whoever does the upsampling, someone can do it better, someone could do it worse. So you kind of need to test 422, 444 into the display and see which one works better. Theoretically, they should be identical, but practically they aren't always.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, and I'm sure you're probably working on ways to test whether it's working correctly or not.
Yes.
Which you did with the original chroma bug, and certainly those of us who review TVs and those of us who care about video quality are going to want those tools, that test pattern rather, that will show you whether it's doing it correctly or not, along with plenty of other stuff. I know you guys are working on that, and
and the pattern will it'll measure in half pixel steps. So you'll have a 0, then you'll have a +5 and a -5, a +10, -10, and whichever one's lined up, it'll tell you exactly what the delay is. So yes, it will be fairly easy to test for.
Yeah, good. So you've been looking at a bunch of HDR TVs, displays, not only TVs, but reference monitors as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the results so far in terms of peak luminance is certainly one variable. Tell us what you found so far in that research.
Right, so we're still trying to figure out all the right metrics, but if you wanted to pull up the image I sent you, it's titled HDR TV Luminous versus pattern size. So this is one of the metrics we're looking at.
That's number one.
That's number one. Yeah, so what we've got here, so the only display we're actually calling out is the Sony BVM, just because it's the reference, it's one of the two reference color HDR monitors, and the rest we've obfuscated to be friendly to the manufacturers right now.
Sure.
Anyway, so what we've got here is, if you look at the left, we've got, basically the nits. So the higher the value, the higher the nits. And here, the 200 to 1400 nits. And then as we go to the right, we have window size. So we start at 1% area, 5%, 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then 100%. So we're looking at how much of the area and how bright it can go.
Yeah,
so
and by the window, we're really talking about basically a black screen with a white window at 100%, I guess, right?
Exactly, at 10,000 nits.
At 10,000 nits or 100% brightness.
Exactly.
And it goes from a 1% of the area to 5% to 10%. The window gets bigger and bigger and bigger as we move along to the right on the horizontal axis.
Right. Now, we also want to be able to go lower. So right now, this 1% is actually not really small enough. If you take an OLED can light up a single pixel pretty much at max brightness. So star fields look beautiful on an OLED. Whereas in LCD, they need to light up so much of an area to actually get a brighter picture. And so if you look at the graph, if you look at the bottom two lines, which
So
those
pull that
displays,
back up here. There you
yeah.
go.
So if you look at the very bottom ones, they start off dimmer with the smaller areas, and as the area gets bigger, they go brighter, which is sort of inverse of what everyone else is doing. In a perfect world, you'd have a flat line across the screen, any size
Right.
at any brightness. But we don't live in that world with power restrictions and stuff. So if you look at the Sony, the BVM, which is the red one,
Which is the red one, right?
right, it goes flat from 1% to 10%, and then it slowly rolls off as the area gets bigger. And so if you're mastering on that type of monitor, you'd kind of want your playback monitors to follow a similar behavior. The Pulsar is actually different, and we don't have the Pulsar data in this slide yet, but we plan to publish that as well.
By the way, the Pulsar is Dolby's own reference monitor, which achieves a peak brightness of 4,000 nits, at least under some conditions.
Right. Well, you'll find it does really well 4,000 nits at many sizes.
So really? Is it pretty?
So
would its line in this graph, if it were there, be pretty flat?
I don't think it's totally flat, but it's flatter than anything else on here.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
But it also consumes 32 amps of power, and it's liquid cooled.
Oh man, it isn't going to get an Energy Star rating anytime soon, is it?
No, and so really today you could say there's only two HDR mastering displays: the Sony BVM and the Dolby Pulsar. The Sony BVM's 30, they're both around 30 inches, 40 inches. I think the Pulsar's 40, but the Pulsar's 1080p and the BVM's 4K. But if you go back to the chart, one of the ones on there is the green line. So the green line's the one that hits the highest brightness so far. But that display, I'm going to say, is cheating because it can only do that for 5 seconds. After 5 seconds, it drops to 500.
I was going to ask you about that because I had heard that even if the TV can achieve a high brightness, only for a certain amount of time, and then it drops back down.
Well, no, all the other displays on here can maintain that brightness indefinitely.
Only the green one.
Only the green one drops after 5 seconds, and it takes a while to recover.
Okay.
So, but
that's an important thing to know.
Yeah, I should qualify OLEDs. If you do put up a static image, they will start to auto dim, and so we can actually work around that. I think there was a presentation at CE Week where they talked about how you need motion patterns to do HDR calibration, which is not true. They could have been talking about OLEDs in this particular problem where they'll dim. So what we do is we'll insert a full field periodically that will reset that problem so it'll never dim. In fact, I think when we measured the LG, it got brighter over time when we kept doing that. You could watch it go up slowly. Didn't get a lot brighter, but it did climb. But
wow,
no,
okay.
all these displays will maintain their brightness except for the green line.
Okay.
For that green display.
Right. Okay, so basically what you're saying is, other than that green one, the green line one, which will fall off after a certain amount of time, the amount, the peak brightness, the amount of light that can come off that screen depends on how much of the screen is being driven to that high brightness, right?
Exactly. And if you think about it, a lot of your specular highlights is where you get the HDR effect, right? It's the pings off cars and from the sun. It's not full fields of brightness. Although the movie that's on Vudu, The Great Gatsby, has 2 fades to white, and those get very bright. And Lucy also has some flashes to white in it, but nothing like The Great Gatsby.
F-Loop has a question here. Is HDR any more demanding on video scaling than SDR? Computing in linear instead of gamma is needed, for example.
So if we're talking about image resizing, I would say it's the same. It's no different there. Although the difference is with traditional video, you don't necessarily know what that gamma is, even though there's now a specification, BT 1886 that defines 2.4 officially versus, hey, this is what we used to use on a CRT. The EOTF for HDR is fixed. So the EOTF, inverse EOTF, you can go to and from linear, I'd say more exactly, or with more confidence. Because you know what the encoding and the decoding side of the curves, what the curve looks like. So you can undo the curve, scale, and put the curve back.
Okay.
Whereas with gamma, it's more hand wavy because you don't really know if that mastering display was 2.4, 2.2.
Right.
That makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's one of the reasons, I guess, why PQ, it's sort of tied to absolute outputs, absolute light levels rather than relative.
Well,
but
then
that
it's the curve is
ahead.
actually defined, but with gamma, it could have been a different power function. No, not everyone may have adhered to 2.4 BT1886, but with PQ, you're supposed to follow the PQ curve on both sides, and so you have the curve defined. I'd say it's more defined. So scaling in linear light is easier because you can go there and back with confidence.
Okay. Right. Somebody in the chat room reminded us, Chumley, here it is, that the Dolby Pulsar is liquid cooled.
Yep.
Which I find very, very interesting. Okay, well, one of the things that we're going to talk about today in some detail is the metadata that is supposed to come along with the HDR signal. And so I'd love for you to give us kind of a refresher primer, if you will, on HDR metadata, what it's for, what does it represent, why is it important?
Sure. Okay. So I assume we're talking about what I call the so-called HDR10. Since there's no official standard, everyone's calling it HDR10.
Right. That's what we're calling it. Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So it's got metadata that defines the display mastering primaries, which is provided in XY coordinates. So you've got red, green, blue, and white, so for your white point. And then you've also got the mastering display's maximum luminance, its minimum luminance, and then you've got the contents, content light level, basically not the brightest pixel, but the brightest subchannel of a pixel, and then the average light level across the entire film as well, which is one of those that doesn't really make sense for static metadata. Metadata that never changes, which is what HDR10 is currently using.
Correct, right. So we have max CLL, which is maximum content light level, which is, as you said, it's not the brightest pixel, but the brightest subpixel.
Exactly. So you could have a red, green, blue triplet, and let's say that green triplet happens to be the brightest pixel in the entire movie. Well, it takes the green value. It doesn't, it doesn't convert to white or anything else. So it's a subpixel. And it's one of the triplets, not all of them. Right.
And then max fall, FALL, maximum frame average light level, is, I guess, as you say, the kind of average light level over the course of the entire movie, right?
Exactly. And that, from an entire movie, that doesn't make sense because you're going to have bright scenes and dark scenes.
Right, exactly.
It makes sense to have that per shot. So like if you look at us, we're talking heads, I'm in a dark environment, I would have one max fall and you would have a completely different max fall.
Isn't there a move afoot to, and by the way, these are what are called static metadata, because they don't change throughout the entire movie or whatever the program is. It's just one value for each of them. Dolby Vision, by contrast, which is the other primary type of HDR, uses dynamic metadata, which defines these sorts of things scene by scene, right?
Well, it actually defines it frame by frame.
Oh,
and it's also, and when it's delivered out of the source device, it's actually embedded into the frame so that it's frame aligned. So you could do dynamic metadata today with UHD Blu-ray or any of these by changing it, but you can't guarantee that by the time the picture hits the screen that the metadata will hit the screen at the same time. There's some amount of latency, whereas Dolby is embedded in the frame on output, and so it is frame accurate and changes per frame.
Well, that's one reason, I guess, then why Dolby Vision does not require HDMI 2.0A, which was made in order to accommodate HDR10 metadata.
Exactly. Although, I was going to say, you can actually stick the HDR metadata in 1.4 as well. A lot of these test pattern generators today are using older transmitters, and we've been able to shove the metadata down there.
Oh, so it isn't 2.0A is not required as it happens.
Well, no, I mean, they're requiring it mostly from the HDCP 2.2 standpoint.
Okay, the copy protection.
They made it easier with HDMI 2.0A, but you can do a lot with an older HDMI transmitter.
Okay.
As it turns out. Yeah.
Right. But here's the really weird part. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you going to say something else?
Yeah, well, what I was going to say was, right now, a lot of the displays are using max CLL for their tone mapping. So that particular parameter is so if the value is 1,000, the display knows that the content's not brighter than 1,000. So if it can't do that, it knows to roll off. So they're triggering off that value.
Okay, and we should explain what tone mapping is. Give us a simple definition of what tone mapping is.
It's just at the most basic level, you're simply adjusting the curve. I mean, if you think about it, a transfer function, gamma PQ, that's actually tone mapping in the most basic sense. But if you have a straight line that goes up, at some point you're going to clip. So instead, you want to roll off sooner, and it's tone mapping.
Okay, so for example, okay, let's see if I got this right. For example, the content was mastered to 1,000 nits of peak brightness, but you're playing it on an OLED, which can't reach 1,000. Maybe it'll reach 500, let's just say. Right. So the brightness gets brighter and brighter and brighter. It starts approaching 500. The content says, I can go all the way to 1,000, but this TV can't. So what do? I have to start rolling off the peak brightness. The brightness, as the brightness gets brighter and brighter, it starts approaching 500. It's going to start rolling until it gets to 500 or so, and then it's not going to get any brighter because the TV can't go any brighter.
Right. It's basically going to compress all the pixels between 500 and 1,000 down to just below 500, where whatever the pixel value for 1,000 nits would be at 500. And then we're seeing some manufacturers who are starting that roll off really soon, and some that are starting off as you get close to it. I forget which display. I think the display did 700 nits, and they started rolling off around 300 or 400 nits, which was way too soon. So the overall image was darker, dimmer. And then others, I think, if you can do 1,000 nits, and if you can do 900 nits and the content's 1,000 nits, you start rolling. You roll off around 800 nits maybe. And I'm just winging this, but
sure. These are just sort of rough examples.
Exactly.
But it's very interesting to hear the different TVs do it differently. And the tone mapping really is the responsibility of the television or the display, is it not?
It is, because the display knows what its brightness capability is. And so, or it could be done. There are others trying to do it. MadVR is a program for Windows that tries to do it in software. You tell it how bright your display is. Lumagen's doing something similar in their Lumagen Pro. You say, my display can go this bright, and so they're going to try to handle it for you. Then you're trying to basically fight against the display's tone mapping.
Isn't that so? Will that be a conflict? I mean, the TV's trying to do it. You've got a processor, an external processor in the signal chain ahead of the TV. It's trying to do it.
For that to work, you really need to map out and understand what the TV's doing so that you can stay just below what it's doing.
Right. Well, we've got a lot more to talk about, but before we do, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Epson. Epson's revolutionary cartridge-free EcoTank line of printers for home and office introduce a new age in printing. The EcoTank ET4550 wireless all-in-one printer doesn't use ink cartridges. It features an amazing, innovative, refillable ink tank, earning it the title of CES 2016 Innovation Awards honoree. There's no more out-of-ink frustration. It includes up to 2 years of ink, equal to about 11,000 black pages or 8,500 color pages. You can save up to 80% on ink with low-cost replacement bottles. It's also powered by Precision Core printing technology. It has auto two-sided printing and a 30-page auto document feeder, and easy wireless printing from tablets and smartphones. All EcoTank printers deliver an unbeatable combination of convenience and value. With Epson's EcoTank line of printers, you'll have the freedom to print without running out of ink. In fact, the Epson EcoTank system was named the 2016 Small Biz Windows Printer of the Year. Visit epson.com/ecotank today to transform the way your home, office, or work group prints. For the best combination of ease and value, turn to the Epson EcoTank printers. That's epson.com/ecotank. And we thank Epson very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks. Epson, exceed your vision. So we've been talking about metadata. And one of the really interesting things that Tyler, your colleague, sent me that we could talk about, and I think is fascinating, is that you've been looking at the implementation of metadata on various Ultra HD Blu-ray discs, most of which, if not all of which, that have been released so far have actually HDR content on them, mastered onto them, in the HDR10, this sort of common way to say it, system. Give us some background and what you found when you've been testing these discs.
Do you want to pull up image number 2 real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a look at image number 2. Nice,
Okay,
nice
so
red and green pie chart. Merry Christmas.
So here we've got, we've actually got more since then, but here's 42 UHD Blu-ray discs, and this is just looking at max CLL and max fall. So as you can see, 27 of them actually have that set to 0, and 15 of them actually have it set to a more realistic value.
What?
And,
You mean to tell me that the majority of the discs you looked at have max fall and max CLL set to 0?
Well, and it's primarily 2 studios right now. It's Paramount and it's Fox. And from what I understand, or my belief is, they're assuming that if you set it to 0, that the display won't perform any tone mapping. Because from what I'm hearing is, people are really happy with the tone mapping Dolby does, but they're not happy with the tone mapping in the displays, and so they'd rather not do any tone mapping. So they're targeting 1,000, as they're hoping that basically all the displays will hit 1,000 and that they won't do any tone mapping.
Yeah, but that's unrealistic because, as we just said, OLEDs, and they're pretty popular, they're out there, can't get anywhere near 1,000.
Exactly. So this is one of the points we want to make, especially to SMPTE, is that this is happening, but it's not only happening with UHD Blu-ray. We've also looked at Amazon and we've looked at Netflix. Amazon, at least through the Samsung player, and we're sure it's not the Samsung player. We're still trying to verify. It's also not setting max CLL. And then Netflix has different issues with the metadata. So this is where it goes back to a lot of, education I think needs to happen around getting the right metadata in there.
Boy, no kidding.
And there was even
Go ahead.
There's even one title that has all the metadata set to 0, including all the mastering display information, which there's only one title that's done that, and it causes this. One of the displays has a problem with that. They won't even go into HDR mode with that. Normally you trigger off the transfer function. That's one of the metadata bits. You can set SDR. Go ahead.
SDR or HDR, gamma or PQ.
Yeah.
And if you set it PQ, then the display should see that and go, oh, this is an HDR, and move into its HDR mode.
Exactly. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of the titles, anything usually from Sony or from Warner Brothers, are being mastered at 4,000 nits. But some of the max CLL values we've seen have hit 9,000.
Whoa!
So,
how is that? How can that be?
That means 1 pixel. It could be as simple as 1 pixel in 1 frame over an entire movie could hit 9,000. Maybe a single pixel clip or channel clip, you don't notice it. So that particular studio is putting in the values, but whereas another studio, they're actually looking for all these outliers. They're looking at all the frames and pulling them out so that they don't skew the curve like that. So that is a more realistic value.
Mm-hmm.
Or it ends up being below 4,000. And if you look at the UHDA has guidelines where they recommend, and again, it's just a recommendation, max CLL 1,000, max fall 400. But I was really concerned when I saw that, and I reached out to the BDA, and they're like, oh, no, that was just a guideline, because I don't think CE companies should be dictating to content providers how bright their content should be. And so they assured me that that's not the case. So,
Well, I mean, certainly CE companies know what their capabilities are, whether or not they can make a TV that can go to a certain level. So why not inform the studios of what their capabilities currently are?
Right, but I mean, a disc format shouldn't say, "Oh, you can't use anything over 1,000," especially when the format goes to 10,000. It just seems odd that they would specify. This is just the disc format, not actual display manufacturers.
I see. Okay. All right. I got it.
But it's just a guideline. And then if you've watched any Voodoo, it's all Dolby Vision right now, and
Exactly.
we've got Warner Brothers and we've got Universal on there, and I don't remember who else is on there. Maybe it's just those two. And so that's 4,000, and on some of the Blu-rays we're getting the 4,000, but on some of that content on Blu-ray we're getting at 1,000. And what they're doing is they're actually using Dolby's technology to convert that down to 1,000 from 4,000. Again, because they don't trust the tone mapping in the displays. That's not Dolby.
So here again we get into this conflict between Dolby Vision and HDR10. We're going to call it that, even though it's not an official name. different capabilities, different mastering. Well, in the case of Sony, you said Sony and Warner Brothers are using the Pulsar, so they're getting up to 4,000 nits on their mastering display. But then they have to change that. Yeah. Sorry.
Sony, Warner, and Universal. Yeah.
Okay, they're all using the Dolby Pulsar, which means they're able to see 4,000 nits, but they know at the moment no TV can do that. So when they do it in Dolby Vision for Voodoo, that's fine. The tone mapping works. But when they transfer to an Ultra HD Blu-ray at with HDR10, they have to kind of take it down to 1,000 before they do that, right?
Some are not.
And
would
you think that? Sorry, would you think that's a good thing?
No, I would prefer to keep it at 4,000 and just hope the tone mapping gets better. Or as I was joking with the studio that was taking it down to 1,000, goes back to they can just re-release a 2,000 nit version later.
Right.
3,000 nit and a 4,000. So it's a chance for them to resell their movies, but
that's kind of cynical, as you say.
Exactly.
Bear Don't Walk 123 in the chat room. Good, interesting screen name there. Is asking a question about Dolby Vision, and we're gonna get to this in a little while. So let me hold off on that question because we're talking about then calibration, which certainly your company is deeply involved in. We're going to get to that right away or soon. But before we do, I want you to tell us about the paper that you're writing for the SMPTE Tech Conference this October.
Okay, so the title of the paper is Notes on the Current State of HDR in HDR Display Technology with emphasis on preserving artistic intent. So we want to talk about Dolby Vision and HDR10. And just to be clear, those are delivery formats. You don't master for those. You master in HDR and you deliver in HDR10 or in Dolby Vision. We want to talk about how to calibrate a professional monitor, which is really straightforward. It's like, and then we want to talk about how to calibrate a consumer display. So we're going to go through all these consumer displays and we're going to see what calibration capability is there. And then we're also looking at the content that's currently being delivered with the metadata and then what these displays are actually doing with the metadata, if anything. So we're trying to encompass as much as possible with the biggest focus is really on the consumer display side, because they'll use these consumer displays as client monitors, or this is how their content's going to be viewed in the end. So I think they probably want to have a good idea on exactly what's happening to their content.
Right. I mean, isn't it true that in a mastering studio, I'm thinking of the recording studio where you've got, really great speakers and amps and so on that aren't going to be found in many homes. And so what they often do is they listen to their mixes on consumer speakers, even cheapies. And so my question here is, don't they do that in a mastering facility? They're looking at a beautiful 30-inch Sony OLED or a 40-inch Dolby Pulsar that are in the tens of thousands of dollars. Are they also looking at their content on a Samsung or a Sony or a Vizio or whatever consumer display just to see what it'll look like?
They are now. So I say this because there's some content that was mastered on the 30-inch, which is beautiful, but it's small. And so it turns out some of this content, when they finally looked at it on a 75-inch display, had a lot of film grain that wasn't actually in the source. They kept adding it, and they couldn't really see it on the small display. And then when they got to the big display, they're like, uh-oh, but the titles have already shipped. So yeah, they're starting to look at 50, 60, 70-inch displays. And for some studios, they've been looking at them for a long time. It's just maybe they weren't looking at it the best display on the consumer side. But you do need to be aware of what it's going to look like. And they tend to use these consumer displays, though, more in compression, because what they'll do is they'll actually turn brightness up so they can actually see compression artifacts.
Ah, okay, right. But then when you set it back to where it's supposed to be, so to speak, then those artifacts are not nearly as obvious.
Right, but when they are looking at it on consumer displays, they are trying to calibrate them. They're not really looking at them in stock mode. They want them as calibrated as best as possible.
Well, given the fact that different consumer displays have different characteristics, OLEDs don't get as bright as LCDs, so on and so forth, wouldn't that mean that they would need to have several set up to look at?
Ideally,
or that
yes.
would be ideal.
That would be ideal, but a lot of them are picking OLEDs. They've got the small OLED to master on, so they want to see it on a bigger OLED. They used to use LCDs. I don't think they're using them as much. For example, Sony now has a 50 or 55-inch OLED their PVM series, which is based on an LG panel. It's based on the 2016 LG panel, but then they've replaced all the electronics with the similar stuff that's in the BVM. It's just a bigger version. Not the same quality level, not the same brightness.
No, and for example, the BVM, the smaller one, uses RGB OLED material, whereas if it's an LG panel, it's probably a WRGB, a white, red, green, and blue, which would give you different performance characteristics, wouldn't it?
Exactly. In fact, on the white OLEDs, if you add RGB up to make white, it's not the same as the white pixel because of the filtering.
What?
Yeah.
It should be, shouldn't it?
It's one of the things they're working on.
Well, there's always something to be working on in this business, isn't there?
Yeah.
Oh,
But it
man.
also means there is a slight resolution difference since the white OLED with WRGB is not really true 3840 across, as opposed to the.
Oh, well, now here's an interesting question, because I've heard of that in what are called pentile displays.
Right.
But I thought that the LG OLEDs, each of the pixels had a white, a red, a green, and a blue. But there wasn't a.
Yeah, but there's not that four pair. There's not 3840 across.
It's so in other words, I go out and I buy an LG OLED 4K. It's not true 3840.
Not in the sense when you add up red, green, blue, and white. No.
Huh. So is there some scaling going on there?
That I don't know. We haven't actually looked into that. I know Florian, who you had on a previous show, has put out a paper that shows the difference, but on a test pattern. But visually, do you see the difference? Especially when a lot of the content you're watching is scaled up from 1080p to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, that's a good point. Okay, so the question that we had in the chat room earlier had to do with calibration. So I'll use it as a springboard for talking about calibration. Bear, don't walk, 1, 2, 3. The Vizio CTO, Matt McRae, has said that to use the Dolby Vision Golden Reference calibration, which you have in SpectraCal CalMan software, for the P-Series display using HDR10 also. They are in the same picture setting. What do you think?
If it used the same tone mapping, that would work. But currently, they're not using the same tone mapping. The tone mapper for HDR10 is different than the tone mapping for Dolby Vision, so you wouldn't use the same golden reference. The golden reference is specific to the tone mapping algorithm. And so if a display uses the same tone mapping for Dolby Vision and for HDR10, then you can absolutely use the same golden reference file. But currently, none of the displays with Dolby Vision are using the same technology for HDR10. That's something that we hope happens in the future. In which case, we hope they can use we hope that HDR10 can use Dolby's tone mapping algorithm.
But they're not currently.
No, they're not.
The only TVs that do have both are the LG OLEDs, and I guess the Vizio P series and M series now.
Yep.
So, but they don't use the same tone mapping algorithm, so they can't do the same thing. So that leads me to ask you about CalMan, the software that SpectraCal makes, and the fact that you've recently you've had a Dolby Vision calibration workflow for a while. Now you have HDR10 as well, don't you?
We do. But the main focus is really on white balance right now, grayscale. The gamut's much more difficult without the tone mapping. Or sorry, without the golden reference. But we have talked to some display manufacturers, and they're looking at providing us the equivalent of a golden reference for the HDR10 side.
And that would have to come from the display manufacturers.
Yes. And it could be specific per model. And in some cases per firmware if they make a change. But
let's see here. Okay, Mike Heiss is asking a question I was going to get to shortly, so let me hold off on that, Mike. Let me go to, we have a couple more graphics, 3 and 4, which was kind of a P3 versus BT 2020 kind of issue. What are we looking at here?
So what we wanted to show, people keep talking about P3 and calibrating P3 in the home, and we wish people would forget about it. You know, P3 is the mastering display. You might master on a display that has P3 primaries, but you're not delivering P3 to the customer. That goes to a transformation that makes it 2020. Now, the color volume or gamut's not any larger than it was on the mastering display, but the RGB triplets are. So what I wanted to show you here was we took a P3 red primary, basically 100% red, 100% green, 100% blue. We give you the XY coordinates, and we show you what that triplet is in RGB. And then once you do the conversion to XYZ to 2020 through XYZ, you notice it's a completely different RGB triplet. So so your content might have been done with P3, but it's converted into 2020, and this is just to show that the RGB triplet is in fact different. So if you were to calibrate your display to P3, then all the colors would be wrong.
Huh. And yet, how can you calibrate to 2020 when the display can't do it? Can't reach those.
You can calibrate to within the capability of the display. And again, the content, even though the content might have been mastered on P3 display and it goes into 2020, you're not increasing the size of the gamut. The gamut's staying the same size.
But you still have to calibrate the display to 2020, right?
Yeah, you want to make sure that within, let me see, let's go, I think it's the next slide.
Number 4.
Number 4, yeah, so this is exactly that. So what we did is we took a bunch of P3 points and we then converted them into 2020. And so this is a display we've measured. In fact, the majority of the displays we've measured actually correctly place. This proves that they're in fact expecting 2020. So even though we started with a P3 triplet, we converted it to a 2020 triplet, and then we measured and plotted. And you can see they're falling where they're supposed to. There is one display that does not do that, and everything comes in undersaturated. They might be calibrating to P3, which would be wrong. And I think they recently fixed that in their 2016 model, but the 2015 model still has the issue. But anyways, what we did here, so if you look, the triangle in this picture is 2020, but the boxes are P3, where they would be if they were P3. And so the outer boxes would be 100% P3. Inside of 2020.
Okay. All right. Well, this is really valuable information because certainly I would think, well, if the TV can do P3, then we should calibrate it to P3. But you're saying if we do that, the actual colors that we get off of a Ultra HD Blu-ray disc or something like that would be wrong.
Exactly. The only way they would be right is if you converted back to 2020, which would make no sense because, you know, you have to go to XYZ, which means you have to convert to linear light. And all that's very expensive processing-wise. And display manufacturers already scale in YCBCR because they don't want to spend the money on the processing power to convert to and from linear light. So it makes no sense to actually convert back to P3. And since the standard is 2020 in the home, you know, with HDMI signaling 2020 and, you know, the HEVC signaling 2020, there's no P3 in any of those spaces. So it is 2020. It's just the color volume we can do today is not any bigger than what P3 would be. And if you look at red is actually, can you go back one slide?
If we go back to number 4, I think.
Number 4. So if you look at the top one, the red, 235/16/16 translates into 209/71/16. Well, it's not actually true.
I'm sorry. We should go back to number 3, I think, shouldn't we?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, sorry. There you go.
So if we look at the very top paragraph or top section where we've got the red, so it's 100% red, 235/16/16 using 8-bit values. In 2020, that becomes 209/71/16. Well, in CalMan, we clamp it to 16 because it's a display and we're not really going to see anything below 16. But if this were actual content, that 16 would be a negative value because you can't represent 100% red. It's outside of 2020. It goes outside, so it doesn't quite fit.
Now, this triplet is, remind me what the value, this triplet value represents.
The 235 is so the first digit is the red channel, the second digit is the green channel, and the third digit is the blue channel. And we're saying 235 would be 100%, 16 would be 0%. So we're saying 100% red, 0% green and blue, which would make 100% red, which is the box in the lower right-hand corner.
Right.
And again, this is a 2020 triangle with P3 100% locations inside of 2020.
Why are you using 8-bit here? Because certainly HDR is 10-bit.
Oh, this is just for as an example. You could multiply all these values by 4 and they would be 10-bit values. But since everyone's used to thinking in 8-bit, we thought this might be an easier way to show it. But instead it would be 940, 64, 64 for the first one.
Right. And then also I wanted to make sure we took a look at the rest of the CalMan 2016 HDR10 workflow, which is new. And I want to make sure people get a chance to take a look at it. Number 5, I think, is just the opening splash screen.
Right. Well, it's 6 and 7. They're actually the same thing, just displayed differently. And that's really what we wanted to show you guys.
Okay, so here's number 6.
So I think in one of your previous talks, the comment came up where we're not we measure the peak value. We don't take you all the way up to 10,000. And we do that to avoid this error. So this one, we're measuring luminance all the way up. Is there any way for you to put up 2 side-by-side images?
I don't know. Let's find out from John,
it's okay.
if we can.
We can switch back and forth.
Okay, we'll switch back and forth.
So if we go to the next image, so 7. 7 is the same thing, but in this example, we stop measuring luminance at the peak of the display, but we let chromaticity continue on. So you'll notice it's a flat line up until to the part where the grayscale is off.
Right, where the red and green go down and the blue goes up.
Right. So this is the difference between the two. In this one, we say, okay, the display only does 1,000 nits, so we're only going to look at luma and use it up to 1,000 nits, and we're going to only look at the chromaticity above that. But in the other one, we do both, but then it gives you this sort of spike up, and people don't understand that or what to do with it. They're much more accustomed to this flat line.
Okay, go back one to number 6, I think. There it is.
Yeah.
Oh, look, they're kind of together.
Yep.
Cool.
So it's basically these are measuring the exact same thing. It's just a different way of viewing the data. The one on the left, we're saying, use the values up to 10,000. The one on the right, we're saying only use luminance up to what we measured as the max luminance.
Huh. So the one on the left, you're saying go all the way up to 10,000, and you're getting this really serious error right around 1,000, it looks like.
Yeah, we're getting the error basically above what the display was capable of.
Okay, but the error starts ramping up pretty low.
Yeah, I don't know which display this was. But anyways, the point here is just to show you the difference between measuring using the max peak luminance of the display versus the peak luminance of the standard, and why we're doing it. I mean, you can view either, but we like to default to the one on the right because it's, if you're just, it's easier. It's a sort of less scary because people they get focused on that huge peak and they're wondering how they bring it down, and you can't because your display, you need a brighter display.
You couldn't do it. You can't. There are no displays. Well, as you say, there might be 1 or 2, but for consumers, there are none that can do 10,000. And
right.
so if you do the measurements expecting and have the software say, okay, I'm going to go all the way up to 10,000, it's going to read a lot of error.
Exactly. And it's going to mislead you. You're going to think it's something you can't, you're going to be concerned about something you can't fix, and it doesn't really matter.
Right, right. Okay, well, I agree. I would rather use the right-hand one as well then.
But within CalMan, you can view either. It's just a setting. So we just happen to default to the one where we only use luminance up to what the peak of the display.
Yeah. Mike Heiss, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, what I was going to talk about was, since we're talking about calibration, some of these displays have multi-point grayscale adjustments. And, it's usually 10% steps from 0 to 100. And for SDR, that works great. But with HDR, those don't line up very well. And what we're finding is different displays. I think we've seen 2 that offer that right now, Vizio and Panasonic, and they all line up at different points. So it's sort of one of those things with HDR. And one of the reasons this is happening is with these early HDR displays, you've got the HDR processing up front, and you have all these existing legacy chips after it, where you do brightness, contrast, sharpness. All these are done expecting SDR. So they're kind of shoving HDR through that. At some point when we get to future generations displays, they'll have a much more optimized pipeline where things line up better and calibration becomes easier. But at this point, it's how can we make, so many parts have to be upgraded. A lot of these video processing chips that manufacturers use.
So what you're saying is, again, we're in the early days. Things will become better later when the brightness, contrast, the grayscale calibration controls and so on are really aimed at HDR.
Exactly.
And that's another problem, isn't it? That has been encountered in a variety of settings where you can calibrate the SDR, but there are no calibration controls in HDR.
And so you bring up another good point. So on one display, one of the streaming providers, they made the display manufacturer default to certain settings. And so, which is great because they didn't like the default settings from the display manufacturers. So they chose ones, sadly, subjectively, what they thought was better. The problem is every time you load that app, it resets the controls. I mean, they actually exposed all the picture controls in HDR. You calibrate them, but next time you run the app, they're all reset back to default.
Oh,
that
man.
They chose. So these are just all these little things that are happening across different TVs and different apps. And the kind of the things that we want to call out, and hopefully they can address.
And this is one of the purposes of your paper that you're going to present at the SMPTE Tech Conference.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Mike Heiss in the chat room, my good friend, asks, do you have any experience with or thoughts on the Technicolor Philips HDR system for content delivery?
My understanding, again, that's just delivery converting, I think delivering HDR, SDR. Beyond that, I don't think it's going to be used in the consumer space, but I don't know. So I don't really have much to say about it today.
Okay. Josh Lamore, from Technicolor, we pre-recorded his show. It's going to be on next week. And so one can learn a lot more about the Technicolor system then. So be sure to tune in. Emily the Strange asks, how does all this fit into theatrical animated movies? I'm thinking of the mastered version of Akira. Does playing animated movies differ from live action movies? How does HDR look on animated versus live?
Well, we have the Peanuts in HDR right now on Blu-ray. It's extremely colorful. And then you've seen theatrical HDR, Inside Out, for example.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now you just need to see it in 3D HDR.
And which we really can't see. There's no way to see it in the theater.
You can overseas, just not in the U.S.
Right. Or actually, you can at the El Capitan in Hollywood, which has Dolby Vision HDR, but it's not an AMC Dolby Cinema, which doesn't typically show 3D, but the El Capitan often does. So that is one place to see it.
Have they showed 3D HDR there yet?
Yeah, they have.
Okay.
And I think I can't remember if I've seen one there or not, but I know they have shown it there. Unfortunately, it uses Dolby 3D, this spectrum separation technique, which interferes or interacts with the glasses and makes it look really funky. I really don't like it at all.
But going back to it, so animations in HDR are going to be far more colorful. If anything hits the sort of edges of the gamut, it's going to be animation, not real-world content. So you can do some really crazy things with animation. And I think of the movie. Did you ever see the movie Coraline in 3D?
I never did, no.
So I consider Coraline to be probably one of the best 3D films, stereoscopic films, because they use 3D for the story. In the fantasy world, or this other world, there was lots of depth, whereas in the real world, it was drab and flat. So you could do the same thing with HDR and animation, or actually in any real movie. You could have a real world that has, a standard dynamic range look, and then you can go to this other world and actually have, your HDR look. So you could use it to tell the story.
I did see Inside Out in high dynamic range, and one of the interesting things about that movie is most of the movie is in P3 color, but then when they get into the deep subconscious, they expand that out to 2020, which is possible because the projectors use lasers, red, green, and blue lasers. And I remember when I first saw it, I didn't know that, and the subconscious world looked, kind of different and kind of amazing, but it didn't really occur to me that it might be a wider color gamut for that scene, but it turns out that's what they did. So that was, again, a storytelling element by expanding the color.
When you look at color in HDR, it's certainly far more colorful. So you could do that same effect, or you could even do 709 in the standard world and then P3 in the hyper world in the home video version if you wanted to.
Yeah, yeah. Wanted to ask you really quickly about a third high dynamic range system called HLG, Hybrid Log Gamma, being developed by BBC and NHK, British and Japanese television stations. Does that have any chance of making an impact on this whole world?
At HPA earlier this year, they were talking about using hybrid log gamma for live broadcast and PQ for home delivery. But with the Olympics, we've seen they've been using PQ for broadcast. So I don't know. I hope not.
Well, well, you don't like it?
Well, from from the demos I've seen, its SDR conversion is not as good as SDR, and its HDR is not as good as HDR. So it's kind of this, it compromises on both sides of the format.
Well, if that's the case, then I would agree with you completely. I would rather see the best possible result coming out of this than kind of a compromised result that talks to both. Okay, so last question for you here. Hermes in the chat room is asking, what's the future of HDR? Dream wildly. What will it look like 10 years from now?
10,000 nits in 2020. I'm sure someone's going to want to do high frame rate, 120 hertz stereoscopic, 10,000 nits through the glasses, you know.
Did you speak? Yeah, okay. So 10,000, but you're thinking 10,000 nits will actually get to the highest level that Dolby identified through tons of research, that's what people want, the consumers. That's what they respond to.
Well, I think one of the things, I own a projector, and so there's really no HDR for projection yet. There's manufacturers claiming they're doing HDR, but no one's really worked on a standard for HDR projection. And I bring this up because what I've seen is the bigger the screen size, it doesn't need to be as bright. You know, when Tyler saw the 120-inch Vizio at 500 nits was way too bright. But on the 65-inch, 800 nits is not bright enough. In fact, one of the things I like to say is, to me, on an LCD, HDR doesn't even begin until you hit 1,000 nits. I think 4,000 nits looks significantly better. And I know there's people are concerned about being blinded by how bright it is. But again, you're not lighting up the whole image. It's specular highlights. It just adds more depth, more color.
Yeah, and as you say, it allows saturated colors over a wider brightness range, which gets back to the issue of color volume. Most of the time we think of color and we talk about the triangle inside of the CIE diagram, but that's two-dimensional. That's only at one brightness level. Really what we're interested in is how does the color work over a wide range of brightness levels. And with high brightness comes greater color saturation at higher brightness. I mean, eventually it'll all go white. But in
SDR it goes white much sooner. And do you want to bring up slide or picture number 8? It's the last one we have.
Yeah.
So this one was added because reviewers want to be able to measure the gamut of the display. And this one happens to be P3, which makes me sad. We're adding 2020 to it because I think reviewers should be referring to coverage of 2020, not P3. But I think reviewers are looking at P3 because the UHD Alliance said, well, let's measure P3. And I think they only did that because 90% of P3 sounds less scary than 70% of 2020.
It sounds better. It sounds better. Yeah.
But anyways, so you bring up a point. Right now we're showing this as a flat 2D image with a XY on the left and U prime, V prime on the right, two different ways, and you see two different numbers. But even this is not great. We've talked about breaking it down into percentage of primary coverage, because you're getting display manufacturers that are claiming greater than 100% of something, because what they're doing is they're areas that they go beyond the color. They're counting that towards areas that they don't quite reach the color. So they're using some creative math. But you're right. Color volume is where we really want to go to measure what a display is capable of.
And do you think CalMan will eventually incorporate some sort of color volume?
It's on the to-do list, yes.
It's on the to-do list, yes.
Well, it's figuring out the best way to do it.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, your color, I forget the name of it. We saw it earlier. I forget which graphic, where you have points along lines leading out to the most saturated.
Yeah, the saturation sweeps.
Saturation sweep. Thank you. Could you do it some way like that?
That's not what we're looking at. I think we're looking at something different. You know, Dolby had some ideas, and it's something we've been thinking about. Even the problem with gamut measurement is there's no standard, which goes back to the point where a display manufacturer, let's say they're 120% of blue and they're 80% of green. Well, you know, they're going to use that extra 20% on blue to compensate for the green when they report their measured number. We had one display manufacturer who I think they've been claiming 90-something% of P3, and when a reviewer measured it, it was like 74% or 80%, and they were freaking out. And again, it's whatever technique they used to measure was different than ours. And our rule is if all primaries don't hit at least 100%, you'll never be 100%.
If all primaries don't hit 100%.
Yes.
Right.
Whereas some display manufacturers are using one primary that goes 120% to compensate for a primary that's only 90%.
Yeah, I've always thought that, yes, I've always thought about this and thought, you know what? When a manufacturer says, oh, we reach X% of P3 or X% of 2020, that doesn't really tell me very much, does it?
No, because
it doesn't,
again, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's no official standard on how to measure this gamut. And it's kind of like contrast ratio.
which we know is a number that you really don't want to trust from a manufacturer.
Exactly.
But even
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, even so, how does a third party measure it? It's not well known, not clear about what should you use ANSI, should you use full on, full off? There's a bunch of different ways to do it.
And there's no agreement on which is the best way. And there's actually working groups focused on trying to figure out how to measure contrast, especially contrast for HDR.
Right. Well, we've come to the end of a more than fascinating hour, and I want to thank you so much for being here. I'm going to keep studying HDR because it's so new and so fluid. There's plenty to learn as we go. And I certainly appreciate your efforts in that regard. You're really at the forefront, and whenever you talk, my ears are wide open.
Well, and our SMPTE talk is late October, so after the SMPTE talk, maybe we can come back on again and talk about the paper and what we've actually discovered then, because there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Love to have you back, and bring a couple of your colleagues along too, and we'll have a party.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much. That's Stacy Spears at SpectraCal. And the website's still spectracal.com, right?
It is.
It is. Okay, good.
Yeah.
But be sure to go there for tons of information and how you can get the equipment and software you need to calibrate or at least evaluate any TV you might have. It's really quite fun. I enjoy it tremendously, and I look forward to continuing to investigate what HDR can bring us. Now, you can find me always at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott and at avsforum. You can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/htg and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit Home Theater Geeks. Next week, as I mentioned, my guest geek will be Josh Lamore, VP of Technology and Ecosystem Development at Technicolor, which we actually pre-recorded last week. So that is in the can and ready to show you next week. And I do hope you will come by and watch that, because it's really quite a fascinating conversation. Until then, geek out.
One of the things the Netflix currently is setting all the data incorrectly. And so if you, on one of the TVs that does both Dolby Vision and HDR10, if you play Netflix in the Dolby Vision app, it looks beautiful. You play the HDR10 from the Xbox One into it, or the NVIDIA Shield, and the image is practically black. But this is something they're going to fix. So hopefully it'll be fixed by the show. Again, so no one's paying attention. They were actually kind of surprised and wanted to know about us looking at the metadata, and so.
So you've been in touch with Netflix?
Yeah. Like, one of their shows was good and a bunch of the others weren't.
In HDR10?
In HDR10, yeah.
But they all look good in Dolby Vision?
They do.
Well, and that's because Netflix is setting the metadata for HDR10 incorrectly?
Or actually, they weren't being set. It wasn't being set at all. It looked like everything was set to 1. Whereas in Dolby Vision, they don't have to set anything. The box does all that for them and provides it. So there's no manual intervention of inputting data.
Well, to the people who ask me, well, we have HDR10. Why do we even need Dolby Vision? There's one answer right there.
Yeah. Well, we need it because I consider them the inventors of HDR. Because they created the curve, they did all the work. They invented the HDR that we're watching today. And so they figured out all the problems, whereas everyone else is actually trying to figure out what they've already solved.
Huh. Wow. John, can you put that in the show?
But, you know, it all comes down to royalties, and I understand people get tired of paying royalties to some companies, and which is too bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, since they did all the research and work, they kind of deserve to get paid for it. But
I would agree with that.
But as more and more papers come out, people will learn how to do tone mapping better. But we really just need a standard. You know, it'd be nice if the ITU would come out and say, here's how you do it, or SIMPI would come in and say, this is how it must be done, and everybody does it that way. Or at least a recommendation.
There was a question in the chat room I didn't get to, which was, do you think that we will see any such standards out of the SIMPI event in October?
I don't know. I know, you know, the ITU recently published a couple new docs. One is a recommendation, and one is, it's not a recommendation, I forget what it's called, where they actually have a tone mapping curve in there. It's not very good. It's got problems with it that has been pointed out, but it's not even a recommendation. I forget what, it's 2309, I think, is the number.
And it's just sort of a suggestion? I don't know what the official name of it is either.
Well, I downloaded it, I think. I don't know where it's at on my desktop. I have stuff everywhere, but...
Yeah, right.
I think it's called a post.
Okay. All right. Well, great. Anything I can do to clear up the whole thing with HDR among my audience, I'm really happy to do. And you've been a big help here today on that regard. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.